Welcome back to Find Your Way to Vibe. I'm Amber, and I'm really glad you're here with me today. However, you're arriving, whether this week has felt steady or stretched thin, whether you're feeling clear or a little cloudy, you're welcome here, just as you are. Today's episode is about boundaries, not as walls or as distance, but as clarity. Because once we begin learning to trust what we feel, something naturally follows. We begin asking, what do I do with this knowing? For me, boundaries didn't show up as confidence right away. They showed up as discomfort and hesitation, as learning how to stay present instead of shrinking. And they grew slowly through small conversations, pausing before answering, saying no without apology, and through staying connected without abandoning myself. And today, I want to explore that kind of growth with you, the kind that unfolds gently through honesty, through courage, and through learning that clarity can actually bring us closer, not push us apart. And before we go any further, let's take a moment to arrive together. Before we begin, take a deep breath with me. Take a slow breath in. And let it out gently. Wherever you are, allow yourself to arrive, to soften your shoulders, to set down whatever feels heavy, and to walk gently into this space with me. Welcome to Find Your Way to Vibe. In last week's episode, we talked about learning to trust what we feel, about slowing down enough to notice what was already there, about realizing that feelings aren't problems to fix, they're actually information, very good information, and about how listening doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. We talked about how trust grows quietly through repetition and returning and through small, steady moments of honesty with ourselves. And as I kept sitting with that idea this week, something else became clear. Trusting what I feel is one thing. Honoring what I feel is another. Because once you start listening, you can't really unhear yourself. Once you recognize tension, exhaustion, or misalignment, you're faced with a new question. What am I going to do with this? For me, that's where boundaries entered the conversation. Not as walls, but as alignment in action. Because honoring your feelings sometimes means saying no. Sometimes it means pausing. Sometimes it means speaking a little more clearly instead of a little more softly. Trust opens the door. Boundaries teach you to walk through it. And today, I want to gently share what that has looked like in my own life. The confusion, the unlearning, the courage, and the quiet growth that followed. And like most weeks, I noticed this lesson showing up in my own life before I even pressed record. Finding my way to vibe this week was all about creating this episode. I had been planning it for a few weeks, but as I finally sat down with the outline and thinking through and finalizing what I wanted to share, I noticed something interesting. This wasn't just something I was preparing to talk about. It was something I was actively living the last few weeks. I found myself practicing boundaries in small but meaningful ways. Some through constructive conversations and some through quiet internal check-ins with myself. I also noticed that it felt like my body was gently asking, are you going to actually listen, or do I need to get a little bit louder for you to hear? The timing felt almost poetic. Those moments became reminders, not harsh ones, but honest ones, that if I'm going to speak about boundaries, I also need to keep honoring them. I need to keep listening and keep paying attention to myself as well. And that brings me to you. I'd love to turn that reflection towards you. How did you find your way to vibe this week? You can share it with me on the contact page at findyourwaytovibe.com or over on Instagram. You can send me a message or tag me in a post. I truly look forward to hearing your stories. Before we move into the deeper reflection for today, let's walk on to our trail of gratitude. For today's trail of gratitude, I thought we would do something just a little bit different than we normally do. And instead, I invite you to think about the boundaries that didn't exist when you were younger. The ones you didn't know you were allowed to have, the ones you softened or ignored, the ones you didn't yet have language for. And instead of judging yourself for not knowing sooner, what if you offered gratitude? Gratitude for the moments that showed you something wasn't aligned, or gratitude for discomfort that signaled your limits, gratitude for the relationships that revealed where you were overextending, or gratitude for the seasons that required you to grow. Maybe today you thank the younger version of yourself who built walls to survive. Those walls weren't weakness, they were protection. And maybe you thank the version of you who is learning to replace those walls with doors. Doors that can open, and doors that can close, or doors that allow connection without self-abandonment. And maybe, if it feels right, you offer quiet gratitude for the people who honored your boundaries, and even the ones who challenged them, because both helped you practice. As you walk your trail today, imagine setting down one old belief about boundaries. Maybe it's, if someone is upset, I must have done something wrong. Maybe it's, saying no makes me selfish. Maybe it's, I should be able to handle more. Let whatever belief it is rest along the path, and in its place carry this. I am allowed to have limits. I am allowed to have needs. And I am allowed to stay connected without losing myself. And with that, I want to share more of what this journey has looked like for me in today's reflection. Boundaries are an interesting topic. For a long time, I didn't even know what boundaries were, let alone my own. I don't think I truly understood them until I was at least in my 30s. And even then, they felt confusing and hard to define. At their simplest, boundaries are the lines we draw around what we will and will not accept. They help us understand where we end and where others begin. They define how we want to be treated, and they require us to communicate that instead of just assuming others should know. Boundaries can be emotional, physical, mental, spiritual. They include our bodies, our time, our energy, our emotions, possessions, and our rights. They protect our space without shutting down connection. I am grateful I eventually learned what boundaries actually are, because before I understood them, I just built walls. Walls felt safer for me. Walls meant I didn't have to explain myself. They meant I didn't have to risk conflict. But what I slowly realized was that those walls didn't just keep other people out and the conflict out. They kept me disconnected from the best parts of myself. They limited joy. They limited honesty and closeness. But understanding boundaries conceptually was only the beginning. When I first started learning about boundaries, I sat in a lot of confusion. I would draw what I thought was a good boundary, only to be met with defensiveness or frustration. And almost immediately, I would roll it back. I just assumed I must be wrong. I didn't want to frustrate other people or make other people angry. I wasn't there to hurt anybody by drawing a boundary, and I didn't want to be the cause of conflict. So instead of reaffirming my boundary, I would just retreat. And when retreat didn't feel like enough, I just built another wall. Looking back, I can see how this may have started early for me. As a child, I watched adults draw boundaries with the kids many times, but it was rare that the kids were allowed to draw them with adults. In addition to that, I saw adults struggle with their own boundary settings, and when they failed to draw boundaries with each other, it would often end in arguments. So I learned two quiet lessons early in life. Those other than me were allowed to draw boundaries. And if someone didn't like your boundary, it would lead to conflict. So I carried those beliefs into adulthood for much longer than I cared to admit. But I thought adults knew everything. Who was I to question? Who was I to say, no, they're wrong? But now I know that being an adult doesn't automatically mean that you know everything. And now I realize that the adults, when I was growing up, didn't know everything. They were still trying to figure it out themselves. And that helped me humanize them just a little bit more and help me understand that they were just doing the best they could with what they knew. And I've come to realize that they probably really didn't understand boundaries then either. So a little bit of grace is given there. And it took me years to realize that not standing my own ground was what was actually creating a lot of chaos in my own life. I was keeping peace externally while creating unrest internally. It wasn't until counseling and group meetings that I began to understand boundaries in a healthier way. I began to understand that drawing boundaries and keeping them are two completely different skills. For a long time, my inability to set boundaries was one of the reasons I pulled back from so many people. It just felt easier to withdraw than to navigate potential conflict. I don't like conflict, so I avoided it. But all that did was push the conflict inward. Learning boundaries hasn't been easy, but it has been transformative. When I first began to understand them, I realized something powerful. Boundaries give relationships room to breathe. They create clarity, which often feels like relief, and they allow us to stay present instead of quietly building resentment. Boundaries make space for honest yeses. They reduce emotional guessing. They protect energy so connection can actually last. And once I understood that, I began responding more in alignment with who I truly was, without drowning in guilt. One of the first ways I practiced boundaries was by saying no to things I genuinely did not want to say yes to. That was huge for me. I used to say yes to everything because I didn't want to disappoint anyone and because I thought I had to. And I didn't want to feel guilty either. But what I began to notice was that when I said yes to things I didn't truly want to do, I would show up irritated and I became annoyed, which is not usually who I am. I showed up half-heartedly, and that behavior did not sit well with me. It took time to learn how to say no in a kind and grounded way, but I began standing up for myself in small moments, and those small moments added up. Saying no to family and friends at first felt like letting them down, and sometimes guilt trips would follow. But I came to understand something simple. Sometimes people just need rest, and that will need to come with a no. And that has nothing to do with anyone else. If someone takes offense to your no, that's worth reflecting on, but it doesn't automatically mean you are wrong for setting that boundary. We live in a culture that normalizes overcommitment. We fill our weekends, we overload our schedules, we say yes out of obligation. And I believe we need to normalize conserving our energy in our best interest. And we need to release ourselves from guilt when we choose not to participate. Someone else's disappointment does not automatically mean you did something wrong. Their feelings are theirs, not ours to carry. That realization for me did not happen overnight. It wasn't until I became more comfortable with boundaries that I began to see how they actually preserved connection. Boundaries can actually invite understanding instead of defensiveness. They can help prevent emotional buildup. They make closeness safer and allow us to stay instead of disappearing to keep the peace. Staying connected sometimes means being clearer, not quieter. For many years, I believed that if I stayed quiet about my needs and made sure I respected other people's boundaries, eventually mine would be respected too. Oh no, I was very wrong in that assumption. Many times when I thought I was expressing boundaries, I was actually minimizing them. I was being passive about them. I softened my words so much that they lost meaning. And in doing that, I unintentionally gave permission for them to be ignored. So I started getting braver and I began speaking more directly. Still kind, still calm, but clearer. It's a work in progress, but I feel myself growing into it. I had a recent conversation that really confirmed this for me as well. I wasn't sure how it would go. I knew it could go one or two ways, but I stayed steady. I didn't over-explain. I didn't shrink. I simply said what needed to be said. And I actually felt safe. I felt heard and I felt respected. There wasn't that emotional spike I used to experience. Internally, I thought, this is how it should feel. Calm, clear, and grounded. Another powerful shift came from learning to pause. Instead of responding immediately, I started giving myself space. Saying sometimes, I need to think about that, or let me get back to you. That small pause gave me something I hadn't allowed myself before. A moment to check in with myself and make sure that my decision aligned with how I was feeling in the moment. In arguments, that pause showed up as saying, I need time to cool down or I need a moment to myself. With invitations to places, I began asking myself, do I genuinely want to go? If the answer was yes, then I would go and I would be glad I did. But if the answer was no, I would stay home and be glad I did. To me, it was a win-win situation when I was checking in with myself first. Even when I was already somewhere, I practiced that same kind of check-in. Do I want to leave? Or do I just need fresh air and a moment to myself? And if I wanted to leave, I would just leave. No explanation, just it's time for me to go. At first, it was hard, and I would start to give excuses, many of them valid, but over time, I realized something that I really didn't need to justify myself. I could simply say no. I could pause and take a moment and do whatever I felt like I needed to for myself. And that was it. And that pause, or the realization that I could pause, didn't just change how I responded in conversations or in arguments or to invitations. It changed how I parented too. Once I learned more about boundaries and ways I could apply them for myself, my parenting shifted in a major way. Because not only did I realize that I could draw boundaries, but it opened the door to me realizing that my kids were allowed to draw those same boundaries. I truly believe children deserve that same ability to draw their own boundaries, to be heard, and to be respected. There have been a few moments with my kids that really stand out to me. Moments where boundaries showed up in very real and honest ways for our family. And in those moments, I learned just as much, if not more, than they did. Those experiences shifted something in me, and they feel important to share. One of those moments is when I found out my son dropped his summer class without telling me during a difficult season of grief and growth for our family. He had chosen to take this class to get ahead, so it wasn't a big deal, but I noticed he wasn't sharing with me any of the progress. So when I reached out to him and asked him about how his class was going, he told me that he ended up dropping it. And I didn't know what to say at first. I just knew that I didn't want to react to it because I didn't even know what to say. So instead of reacting in the moment, I decided to take a pause, and I told him that we would talk when I got home. And on my way home from work, I just drove and pondered what I was going to say to him. And I just was trying to figure out like what may have caused him not to feel comfortable enough to come and tell me that that's what he needed to do for himself. So with that in mind, when I got home and we talked about it, instead of berating him or getting upset with him because he didn't tell me or because he dropped a class, I apologized to him. And I let him know that I was sorry for not recognizing what he was carrying and for not feeling like he could come to me with that kind of a thing. I felt like I should have been better at recognizing what he was going through in the moment. And that's why I apologized. And I reminded him that he has a voice and that his needs matter, that he can make decisions for himself, and I will listen, especially within reason. So by the end of the conversation, he apologized for not telling me sooner, and I apologize for not making him feel comfortable enough to come and talk to me about those things. And that was boundaries in action. There was no control, no anger, just guidance and understanding and realization that sometimes people are going through some things that we may not understand, but if they communicate with us, we can try to understand and support them. And that was a huge thing for my son and I. I feel like that day we became closer and he was able to come to me with more. So that was huge in my book. When it comes to my daughter, our experience, one of them was that she was going to college. It was right after 2020 again, and we were going through the same grief and growth process with our family. It was in that same time period, and she decided to come to me and tell me that college didn't feel right to her and that she needed time to figure out her own path. At first, I didn't know what to say, and I kind of felt like a twinge of disbelief of what I was hearing because I thought she was steadfast in her goal and what she wanted to do. But once I listened to her, I recognized what she was doing, and she was letting me know what she needed for herself and drawing a boundary with me. She was honoring her own direction while still respecting me and letting me know what she was doing. And I respected her right back. And that gave us that open space as well. So both my kids have just paved their own path and have taken off because I feel like our boundaries have been set in a really real honest way, and they've changed the dynamics of our lives. I can't complain about learning about boundaries. They have been pretty pivotal in my life. They changed how I handle situations with myself and with others, obviously my kids. They've softened my reactions. They've strengthened my voice. And perhaps most importantly, they've allowed me to stay connected without losing myself, which is something that has been foreign to me because I usually lose myself in trying to connect, and so to speak. And I'm still learning, but I'm learning from a place of clarity now, not confusion. And I'm learning to have more courage and less fear. And that feels like growth to me. Like I feel like I have grown tremendously through it. But I've also learned that it isn't static. When I allowed myself to surrender to the act of creating boundaries, I realized something important. Boundaries are not a set it and forget it kind of thing. They're not a line you draw once and never revisit. They are living. They move as we move. They evolve as we evolve. Some seasons require firmer clarity. Other seasons allow for softness. What felt necessary 5 years ago might feel different today. And that doesn't mean we failed. It means we're growing. I began to notice that boundaries weren't about getting it right. They were about paying attention, learning from the small moments, noticing when a boundary felt forced versus grounded. recognizing when I was speaking from tension instead of calm. A forced boundary often feels, to me, it feels tight in my body. It feels a bit overwhelming or almost a sense of urgency. Whereas a grounded boundary feels a little bit steadier and it doesn't need to be loud. I don't need to scream it. It doesn't need to convince anyone. It simply just states what is there, what is true to me. That distinction took time to learn. And along the way, there have been many missteps. I have had many moments where I said yes when I meant to say no. Times where I overreacted and felt rigid, and times I spoke too late and resentment was already there. But here's what changed everything. I stopped expecting perfection. One of the lessons I carried with me from my time in CODA was that this program was about progress, not perfection. Boundaries are not about becoming flawless. They are about becoming more honest, little by little. And another lesson that stayed with me was this: I'm not responsible for other people's feelings, and I'm not responsible for fixing them either. That one took practice, and I'm still working on that as well. And sometimes it sneaks in even when you think you got a handle on it. But I'm working on it. I'm working on it. Caring about somebody does not mean carrying their emotions for them. Loving someone does not require absorbing their discomfort. And setting a boundary does not mean you have failed at compassion. I also learned something simple but powerful. I am allowed to draw boundaries and stick to them. Allowed. Not because someone gave me permission, but because being human includes having limits. It includes having needs. It includes having a voice. We don't come with a manual for how to navigate relationships or life. We are all learning as we go. And sometimes learning means we try something, realize it wasn't aligned, and adjust. We pivot. We may slip up or overextend. We shrink. We harden. We soften again. That's not failure. That's just practice. And if you find yourself thinking, I should have handled that differently, you're allowed to run it back. You're allowed to say, I need to revisit that. You're allowed to clarify after the fact. You're allowed to grow in real time. Boundaries are not proof that we figured everything out. They are evidence that we're willing to stay in a relationship with ourselves. We were given a voice, not to defend ourselves constantly, but to express what is true for us. Using that voice gently, consistently, imperfectly is part of what makes connection sustainable. You don't have to master boundaries. You just have to keep learning them. And before we close, I want to honor something that helped me along that path. So this week's Brooklyn Lights the Way is dedicated to those I connected with in conversations about boundaries. When I think about learning to draw boundaries, I don't just think about the courage it took within me. I think about the rooms that held me while I was learning. There were circles I sat in quietly at first. Rooms where people spoke honestly about their limits, about their fears, about saying no and feeling guilty, about overextending and then finding their way back. No one was performing, and no one was pretending to have it all figured out either. People were simply practicing out loud. And something about witnessing that shifted me. I watched people say, "That doesn't work for me." I heard people admit, "I'm still learning." I saw how boundaries didn't end connection in those rooms. They deepened it. Those were shining lights along my way. Not because anybody told me what to do, but because they showed me what honesty could look like in real time. They helped me see that I was allowed to have limits, that clarity doesn't have to be loud, that practicing out loud is still practicing. And sometimes the greatest light comes from simply sitting in a room where truth is welcomed and learning you're allowed to speak yours too. And maybe that's where we begin to land today. As we close today, just remember, boundaries aren't something you master in a week. They're practice. And if you're anything like me, you might still be figuring them out in real time. You might still catch yourself saying yes when you meant no. You might still soften your words more than you need to. Or you might still feel that old pull toward over-explaining. That doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're learning. And this week, I invite you to simply notice. Notice where your body tightens in a conversation. Notice when you feel that quiet internal no. Notice when you say yes and immediately feel drained. And notice when you say no and feel relief. Just pay attention and ask yourself, where am I honoring what I feel? And where am I abandoning it? No judgment, just curiosity. And if one small opportunity comes up for you this week to pause, to speak a little clearer, to leave when you're ready, try it. See how it feels. Because boundaries aren't about controlling anyone else. They're about staying connected to yourself. And that connection, that steady, grounded self-trust, is what allows everything else to grow in a healthy way. I'm still practicing. I'm still learning. And if you are too, you're in good company. I'm so grateful you're here sharing this space with me. And until next time, walk slowly, breathe deeply, and remember to find your way to vibe.